The veil thins as the year leans into its final darkness. And in the cold stone silence of this tower, I can feel what you have felt long before you had words for it. The trembling music of an Aeon ending. You sit here not merely as a sensitive soul, but as a sentinel stationed at the edge of the collective unconscious, perceiving the first fractures in the world's old psychic architecture. Others will call it anxiety, unrest, collective fatigue. But you know it as something older, deeper, almost prophetic. The great separation that has already begun its slow unfurling between what humanity has been and what it is being forced to become. You feel the shift as a stirring beneath your ribs, as though the atmosphere itself is pressing you toward a threshold you did not choose but cannot avoid. The empath always perceives the future long before it arrives. For your nervous system is not merely personal. It is a tuning fork vibrating with the psychic weather of the age. And now the weather has turned. You sense the ending because you have lived endings since childhood. Quiet ones, invisible ones, the kind that erode the soul in small and unmarked ways. The world taught you early to anticipate rupture. It taught you silence as survival, self-erasure as harmony, self-sacrifice as love. And so you became what the world demanded, the child who felt too much and therefore pretended to feel nothing. The child who carried too much and therefore claimed to need nothing. The child who absorbed too much and therefore learned to become the emotional container for everyone else. You were fashioned into a role, not raised into a self. And now that role is collapsing. Your exhaustion is not ordinary. It is not the tiredness of muscles or the weariness of routine. What you feel is the psychic death of the persona, the nice persona you constructed to survive a world that never learned how to see you. The persona is a mask woven from accommodation, self-minimization, intuitive labor, and 1,000 subtle surrenders. It has served you as armor and prison alike. But masks cannot breathe, and they fracture under the pressure of authenticity. As this Aeon shifts, the persona you formed out of childhood necessity becomes incompatible with the soul you are becoming. This is why you are so tired. It is not burnout. It is metamorphosis. Strangling in a skin that no longer fits. The nice persona was built on the illusion that if you were gentle enough, patient enough, forgiving enough, the world would not wound you. You believed peace would come from making yourself easy to love. But this ideal was a compensation for an ancient wound, the wound of being unseen. The child who is unseen becomes the adult who overfunctions. The child who is unprotected becomes the adult who shields others beyond her capacity. The child who is unloved for who they are becomes the adult who tries to earn belonging by offering endless emotional labor. This is not kindness. This is appeasement forced into the shape of virtue. And the soul cannot sustain such contortions indefinitely. Beneath the nice persona lies the deeper trap, the first of the two archetypal distortions that ensnare the empath, the savior. This archetype forms not from arrogance but from fear. The fear that if you do not heal the other they will collapse, and their collapse will engulf you. The savior is born from environments where you learned that your safety depended on stabilizing the emotional chaos around you. You became attuned to every shift in tone, every shadow of mood, every psychic tremor. You learned to anticipate storms and to neutralize them before they erupted. You mistook vigilance for virtue. You mistook control for compassion. But the savior complex is a paradox. In healing others, you postpone your own healing. In rescuing others, you avoid descending into the depths where your own shadow waits with the truth you have long postponed. Every time you reach outward to save someone, you abandon the inner figure calling for your attention. The neglected inner child, the repressed rage, the unmet grief, the authentic self buried beneath decades of emotional contortion. The savior archetype promises power, but in truth, it drains you of it. It gives you purpose but not identity. It masks your pain but does not cure it. And worst of all, it binds you to those who feed on your psychic labor while giving nothing in return. The second trap is even more insidious, for it masquerades as empathy itself, the mirror. You do not merely feel others. You become them. In the presence of another, your psyche shifts its shape to match their emotional frequency. Their fears become your tension. Their desires become your direction. Their wounds become your mission. Over time, this reflex becomes so ingrained that your own emotional center dissolves. You know how everyone else feels but cannot locate your own feelings. You navigate life not from an inner axis, but from 1,000 borrowed signals. You become a gallery of reflections with no original portrait. This is why you feel lost. This is why decisions exhaust you. This is why relationships consume you. This is why you walk away from interactions feeling hollowed, as though pieces of you have been scattered across the psyches of others. The mirror does not allow individuation. It interrupts the formation of the self. It traps you in perpetual psychic adaptation, always bending, always adjusting, always attuning, until you disappear into the emotional landscapes of others. The mirror makes you lucid to everyone but blind to yourself. And now, as the great separation approaches, these archetypes strain under the weight of their own contradictions. The Savior cannot save those who do not wish to heal. The mirror cannot continue reflecting a world that is itself fractured. The persona cannot survive a time that demands authenticity. And the empath, you, cannot carry the psychic burdens of an age that is cracking open. Your attempt to do so is what is killing you. If you enter 2026 with the identity your childhood forced upon you, you will not withstand the psychic intensity of the coming shift. The world is accelerating toward a confrontation with its own shadow. Structures are breaking. Old narratives are collapsing. People are losing their illusions faster than they can replace them. If you remain a mirror, you will absorb chaos not meant for you. If you remain a savior, you will be pulled into crises that have nothing to do with your destiny. If you remain inside the nice persona, you will fracture under the pressure of maintaining an identity that was never yours to begin with. This is not melodrama. It is enantiodromia, the ancient truth that everything pushed to its extreme becomes its opposite. The empath who tries to save everyone becomes the one who needs rescuing. The empath who reflects everyone becomes the one who can no longer find their own reflection. The empath who tries to maintain peace becomes the one who burns silently from within. If you continue into the new Aeon with these archetypal distortions intact, they will turn against you. They will devour the very qualities that make you who you are. Something in you already knows this. Something has been breaking quietly for months. The persona is thinning. The savior is weakening. The mirror is cracking. What you feel right now, the fatigue, the disorientation, the strange pulling sensation in your inner life, is not failure. It is the first sign that your true self is rising from beneath the ruins of the childhood story that once imprisoned you. But you must allow the collapse. You must stop patching the mask. You must let the false identity die. For if you do not, the new year will do it for you. The collapse, once it begins, cannot be reversed. And you have felt this truth pressing against the back of your mind like a dream you fear to remember. It is not merely your habits that are breaking. It is the psychic story you inherited before you even knew you were living inside one. Every empath carries a childhood myth, a script written not in words, but in emotional patterns. Be harmless. Be useful. Be attuned. Be available. Be small. Be good. This myth was never yours. Yet it became the architecture of your very identity. Now the architecture groans. Now the walls shift. Now the foundation trembles beneath the weight of a self that no longer consents to confinement. You stand at the threshold of an inner tectonic shift, and the unconscious has grown impatient. The images erupting in your dreams, the storms, the collapsing houses, the strange figures calling your name, are not random. They are messages from the shadow, announcing that the time of sleep is over. What is rising in you is not rebellion but restoration. Yet restoration always begins with destruction. And so the persona you built to navigate the emotional demands of others begins to crack, revealing the deeper layers of the psyche that have been waiting decades to breathe. The nice persona cannot cross into the new Aeon with you. It was constructed in response to the wounds of adults who could not carry their own emotional weight. And so they placed it upon your young and permeable spirit. You adapted because adaptation was survival. You smiled because silence was dangerous. You forgave because truth was punished. You learned serenity in the midst of storms you did not create. But every adaptation has an expiration date. And yours has arrived. What once protected you now suffocates you. What once made you lovable now renders you invisible. What once kept the peace now costs you your authenticity. You feel this death of the persona as a peculiar grief, an ache that has no apparent cause. You are mourning the loss of an identity that was never truly you. Yet it feels like losing a limb because it has been attached to you for so long. There is no way to shed it without feeling disorientation. But understand this: disorientation is evidence of rebirth. The self does not emerge through clarity, but through dissolution. The old structure dissolves. The boundaries blur. The familiar signposts vanish. And in that liminal space the unconscious begins its slow ascent. Yet it is in this same liminality that the traps of the savior and the mirror become most dangerous. When the persona weakens, the psyche becomes porous. Old patterns return like ghosts seeking a body to inhabit. People who once depended on your emotional labor will feel the shift. Even if they cannot name it, they will reach for you, not out of malice but out of habit, the habit of leaning on your empathic resilience. You will feel their pull. It will come as guilt, urgency, responsibility, the old instinct to fix, soothe, harmonize. But these impulses are remnants of an outdated identity. If you succumb to them now, you delay your transformation. If you continue rescuing others, you abandon yourself at the very moment you are finally within reach of your own integration. The savior archetype does not unravel easily. It has been entwined with your self-worth for so long that you may confuse withdrawal with cruelty. Understand, boundaries are not punishment. They are individuation. The unconscious demands that you step out of the role of healer so that you may confront the unhealed places within your own psyche. Until now, your compassion has been a shield against your own depth. To descend into that depth, the shield must fall. Only then can the lost fragments of yourself come home. But more perilous still is the mirror, for it hides in the very mechanism you use to understand the world. The mirror will try to reassert itself the moment you experience uncertainty. It will urge you to look outward instead of inward, to calibrate yourself to others, to reabsorb their moods and reflect their expectations. It whispers that belonging requires blending, that safety requires invisibility, that harmony requires self-erasure. This is the lie that held you captive through childhood. Now it seeks to reclaim you. And if you allow it, you will again dissolve into the emotional atmospheres of others, losing the fragile formation of self that is just beginning to emerge. To resist the mirror, you must do something that once felt dangerous. You must become opaque. You must allow others to feel what they feel without intervening. You must let their storms rage without stepping into the role of interpreter or stabilizer. This is not indifference. It is psychic sovereignty. Until the empath becomes sovereign, they cannot individuate. They merely circulate their identity through the reflections of others. Opacity is the first step toward reclaiming your psychic center. You may notice the world responding strangely as you attempt this shift. People who once admired your kindness may now accuse you of coldness. Those who once praised your empathy may now sense an unfamiliar boundary and interpret it as withdrawal. Those who relied on your emotional labor may feel abandoned. But these reactions do not reveal who you are. They reveal who they were allowed to be when you denied your own needs. The moment you stop absorbing the emotional overflow of others, they must face the truth of their own inner landscape. This is uncomfortable for them, but it is liberation for you. As the great separation accelerates, the collective psyche is dividing into those who cling to old illusions and those who are being forced into self-confrontation. You, as an empath, have always been ahead of this curve. This is both your gift and your burden. You feel the collective shadow rising. You sense the unraveling beneath the surface of daily life. You know that the world cannot continue as it has, for the unconscious will not permit the lie to persist. But sensing the collapse and participating in it are two different tasks. The unconscious is asking you not to hold the world together, but to hold yourself together as it falls apart. For the empath who has lived too long as savior and mirror, this is the most radical act possible. You are being summoned not to heal others, but to reclaim the self buried beneath decades of emotional servitude. The childhood story that forced you into perpetual attunement is ending. But its ending requires that you stop reenacting it. The child who once believed that love must be earned through suffering is no longer in command. The soul has taken the reins. And the soul has no interest in repeating a narrative that kept you small. The danger of entering 2026 with the old identity is not symbolic. It is psychological. The unconscious is rising with the force of a tide. And those who refuse transformation will be dragged by it rather than guided. The empath, more than any other type, is susceptible to psychic overload when the collective field becomes unstable. If you carry the same porous boundaries, the same reflexive attunement, the same compulsive self-sacrifice into the coming year, you will find yourself drowning in emotions that do not belong to you. The energy of the age is too volatile for the old adaptations to remain intact. This is why the unconscious is breaking you open now. It is not punishment. It is preparation. You are not meant to be the emotional container of the new world. You are meant to be its compass. But a compass cannot function if it is magnetized by the moods of others. To rise out of the story your childhood forced you to live, you must allow that story to die. You must refuse the roles that were assigned to you before you knew you had a choice. You must walk away from the identity that once kept you safe but now keeps you small. The unconscious is calling you toward the deeper strata of your being, where the authentic self waits with the authority you have long been denied. This is the threshold. And once crossed, nothing in you will ever tolerate the old life again. Something in you has already stepped beyond the threshold. Though your conscious mind may still cling to the remnants of who you once were, the shift is not loud. It does not arrive with fanfare or triumph. It comes as a quiet and unsettling realization: I cannot go back. You may not yet know where you are going, nor what shape your becoming will take. But you feel the irreversible nature of this inner movement. Once the self begins its ascent, it does not retreat. The unconscious does not negotiate with the persona. What is rising now is older than your fear and more patient than your resistance. This is why your relationships feel strange. Why the dynamics you once tolerated now feel intolerable. Why conversations that once felt familiar now feel hollow. You are not losing touch with people. You are losing resonance with the version of yourself they were accustomed to. The world responds not to your soul but to your persona. And when the persona shifts, the world shifts accordingly. This is why the empath feels abandoned during transformation. Not because people have changed, but because the mirror you once held for them has shattered, and they do not know how to relate to the being who emerges from behind it. In this stage of your metamorphosis, the unconscious demands a reckoning with the emotional architecture of your childhood, not to punish you but to liberate you. The story you were forced to live was a story of emotional servitude. You were praised when you were useful, criticized when you needed care, and ignored when you required presence. You learned that your value lay in your capacity to absorb, soothe, adapt, and stabilize the emotional world around you. This became your survival strategy and thus your identity. But an identity built from necessity is not the same as a destiny born from authenticity. Now the unconscious calls you to confront the origin of the lie, the belief that you exist to manage the inner lives of others. This belief is the root of both the savior and the mirror. It is the central distortion through which you learn to relate to the world. And as you peel away the layers of this distortion, you may feel exposed in a way that is almost painful. You are meeting aspects of yourself that were exiled for decades. Anger that was forbidden, boundaries that were punished, desires that were dismissed, instincts that were overwritten by duty. These are not flaws. They are fragments of yourself returning home after a long banishment. The most disorienting part of this return is the emergence of your true emotional center. For years, perhaps your entire life, your emotions did not originate within you. They were responses to the emotional climates of others. You developed a sophisticated internal radar, always scanning for shifts, tensions, unspoken expectations. You mistook hypervigilance for intuition. You mistook exhaustion for empathy. But the psyche cannot differentiate between adaptation and authenticity until the persona collapses. It is only now, in the quiet aftermath of this collapse, that you begin to feel emotions that are undeniably yours. They may appear as a strange heaviness or an unexpected clarity, or a sudden refusal to endure what once felt normal. These emotions are not symptoms of instability. They are the first signs that you are returning to yourself. Yet this return carries a paradox. As you reclaim yourself, the world that once depended on your compliance begins to resist. The individuals who fed unconsciously on your emotional labor may sense your withdrawal as a threat. They may attempt to pull you back into the roles that serve them. Their fear will disguise itself as concern, their dependency as affection, their control as love. They may ask why you have changed, why you are distant, why you no longer feel like yourself. But understand, what they are really asking is why you no longer feel like what they needed you to be. This is the part of the journey where the empath must walk through the fog of guilt. Guilt is the final chain of the childhood story. It binds you to the persona more tightly than fear or obligation. Guilt tells you that boundaries are abandonment, that self-focus is selfishness, that self-protection is cruelty. But guilt is the voice of a system in which your needs were never meant to exist. It is the residue of conditioning that taught you your worth was measured by your utility. To break free from guilt is to commit a symbolic act of treason against the emotional order of your past. It is also the only way to step into sovereignty. As you approach the deeper layers of transformation, you may feel an unsettling emptiness. The savior is weakened. The mirror is shattered. The persona is dissolving. What remains is a vast psychic space that feels unfamiliar, almost disorienting. But this space is necessary. The selves you have carried, the healer, the listener, the peacemaker, the emotional interpreter, are no longer occupying the center of your identity. For the first time, the center is empty, ready to be reclaimed. This emptiness is not a void. It is a sacred clearing. It is the psychic ground on which the true self will build its foundation. But the unconscious warns you, do not rush to fill this space with new roles, new rescuers, new distractions. The psyche must breathe. It must reorganize. It must realign its energies without the gravitational pull of outdated archetypes. If you rush the process, you simply recreate the same patterns in new forms. The savior may return as the supportive partner. The mirror may return as the overly compassionate friend. The nice persona may return as the emotionally mature one who always understands. These are the same roles dressed in new costumes. They are remnants of the childhood story attempting to reassert themselves. You must resist this temptation. This is the season of standing still within your own being, letting the old energies drain from your system. Your nervous system, attuned for decades to the emotional weather of others, is recalibrating. You may feel fatigue, confusion, moments of irritability or sharp clarity. These are not regressions. They are the indicators that your psychic boundaries are forming. For the first time, your system is learning the difference between what belongs to you and what does not. The danger of the coming year lies precisely here. The collective psychological field is unstable. Illusions are cracking. People are projecting their shadow onto one another with increasing intensity. If you enter this field without boundaries, you will once again become the container for chaos that is not yours. But the unconscious is offering you a different path. It is no longer asking you to carry the world. It is asking you to carry yourself. The self emerging within you is not fragile, though you may feel fragile as you shed the last layers of your old identity. This emerging self carries a different energy, one that is not built on accommodation but on clarity, not on self-erasure but on presence, not on rescue but on sovereignty. It does not seek to be understood, nor does it sculpt itself to be acceptable. It simply is. And those who cannot meet it will fall away, not because you have failed them, but because you have ceased to perform the version of yourself that once comforted them. You are rising out of the story your childhood demanded. This rise is not dramatic. It is inevitable. It is the evolution of a soul no longer willing to exist as a reflection. And as you step deeper into this becoming, the unconscious whispers a truth you have waited your whole life to hear. You were never meant to be anything other than yourself. There comes a moment in every true transformation when the psyche stops asking and begins insisting. You are no longer being invited into yourself. You are being taken. The unconscious has pried open the inner doors that once kept your authenticity sealed behind years of adaptation. And now the self steps forward with a quiet yet immovable authority. This is the moment when the empath rises, not through effort but through inevitability. You do not become powerful. You return to the innate power that was diverted, suppressed, and fragmented in childhood. And as this return unfolds, the world you once knew cannot help but rearrange itself around the new center you have claimed. In this final crossing, you will notice a strange clarity descending upon you. It is not dramatic. It is not euphoric. It is a stillness, a lucidity that feels almost ancient. You begin to see the architecture of your old life with piercing precision. You see how you were shaped by the wounds of others, how your identity was braided into the emotional dysfunctions of your environment, how your sense of self-worth was tied to the invisible labor you performed for people who never knew the cost. You see how every relationship, every choice, every pattern echoed the same central myth: I must diminish myself to keep the world stable. And with this clarity, the myth finally dissolves. What takes its place is not defiance but truth. You realize, perhaps for the first time, that your existence was never meant to orbit the needs of others. The idea that your empathy is a burden, that your sensitivity is a flaw, that your boundaries harm those around you. These beliefs were forged in childhood as mechanisms of survival, not reflections of reality. They were the psychic tools you used to survive a world that did not understand the depth of your perception. Now those tools have completed their task. They are relics of an identity you have outgrown. As this truth anchors itself, you begin to notice something else. Your energy is no longer leaking into the emotional atmospheres around you. There is a reclaiming happening, a gathering of fragments that you scattered throughout years of mirroring, rescuing, absorbing. These fragments return not as memories but as strengths. A strength that feels both foreign and intimately familiar. It is the strength of someone who no longer apologizes for existing. The strength of someone who can meet their own shadow without dissolving. The strength of someone who understands their sensitivity not as weakness, but as perception unclouded by illusion. This reclamation is the point at which the savior archetype falls away. When you are no longer afraid of your own depth, you no longer need to distract yourself with the depths of others. When you understand that every soul must walk its own labyrinth, you stop carrying people who refuse to walk. When you recognize that your worth is inherent, you stop offering yourself as emotional currency to be exchanged for approval. You finally see that rescuing others was a way of postponing your own resurrection. Now resurrection is no longer optional. It is the path. The mirror too loses its power over you. As your inner axis strengthens, the emotional frequencies of others cease to swallow you whole. You feel them but you do not become them. Their fear no longer becomes your anxiety. Their anger no longer becomes your agitation. Their emptiness no longer becomes your mission. You begin to experience a boundary that is not defensive, but inherent. A psychic membrane through which you perceive the world without dissolving into it. For the first time, you can witness without absorbing, understand without merging, love without losing yourself. This is the hallmark of psychic sovereignty. And once sovereignty begins, it does not retreat. As you stand in this new psychic landscape, the world around you begins to shift. People who once felt entitled to your compassion may now feel unsettled by your clarity. Those who relied on your emotional labor may accuse you of selfishness, not because you have become selfish, but because your selfhood no longer serves their unconscious needs. Those who once manipulated you through guilt or crisis may find their tactics ineffective. For you now recognize the difference between love and dependency, between empathy and enmeshment, between responsibility and sacrifice. You no longer collapse at the sign of someone else's suffering. You no longer confuse urgency with importance. You no longer abandon yourself at the slightest hint of displeasure. This does not mean you love less. It means you love differently, with boundaries, with discernment, with truth. Genuine empathy cannot exist without integrity. And integrity cannot exist when the self is sacrificed for others. The empath's power was never meant to be used as currency in relationships. It was meant to illuminate, not compensate, to reveal, not rescue, to perceive, not absorb. Now your empathy becomes what it always was meant to be, a lens, not a leash. And so we arrive at the final truth of your rising. The story your childhood forced you to live is not the story you are destined to carry into the new Aeon. That story was written in fear, shaped by survival, and forced through emotional scarcity. It taught you to compress your soul into forms that others found comfortable. It demanded that you trade authenticity for acceptance. It kept you in perpetual service to wounds that were never yours. But the time for that story has ended. The self emerging within you refuses to reenact a narrative forged in powerlessness. The great separation of this age is not only collective, it is internal. You are separating from the version of yourself who believed love required self-erasure. You are separating from the role you played in other people's stories. You are separating from the emotional inheritance of your lineage. This separation is painful, for all endings carry grief. But grief is not a sign you are losing yourself. It is a sign you are returning to yourself. What waits on the other side of this return is not a louder or more forceful version of you. It is a clearer one, a truer one. A self that does not bend for approval, does not shrink for peace, does not bleed for belonging. A self whose boundaries form naturally, whose presence is steady, whose intuition is no longer compromised by the noise of others. A self capable of discerning connection from attachment, empathy from enmeshment, compassion from self-sacrifice. A self who knows that to love others authentically, you must first refuse to abandon yourself. This is the empath who rises. This is the empath who is no longer living the story their childhood dictated. This is the empath who becomes an agent of consciousness, rather than a container for others' unconsciousness. This is the empath who steps into the new Aeon not as a vessel of burdens, but as a bearer of clarity. And when clarity becomes your core, the world no longer defines you. You define your place in the world. The unconscious is clear in its message. You were never meant to remain in the shape others carved from your childhood. You were meant to outgrow it, to break it open, to rise from it. And now you are rising. Your task is not to return to who you were. It is to become who you have always been, beneath the roles, beneath the masks, beneath the wounds. The empath is rising not into a new story but into their self. Please like and subscribe for more such videos.